This is lecture 1.4 in pre-algebra. The name of this section is called multiplication with negative numbers. Now, each of you have gone through your multiplication tables since third grade and know how to multiply numbers such as 3 times 5, 4 times 7, 26 times 347, etc. But one of the things that gets a little bit more confusing is when you're trying to combine both positive and negative numbers to multiply. So if we have a number like 3 times 5, and I'll use a dot there as a multiplication sign, that should be familiar to you, you get 15. But what happens when that 3 is a negative number and we multiply it by a 5? Okay, or if both the 3 and the 5 are negative, what happens? Alright, so there's two rules to be reminded of when you're multiplying both positive and negative numbers. The first rule is if the signs are different, you multiply the two numbers, and if the signs are different, you always get a negative for an answer. So if you have a negative and a positive and you're multiplying them together, you're going to get a negative answer. If the signs are the same as they are in these two, 3 times 5 is positive 15, negative 3 times negative 5 is also positive 15. And one of the things I want you to look at here, and sometimes you'll use this, sometimes you won't, it just kind of depends on if you remember or not, but it always works. If the number of negative numbers in a multiplication problem are odd, you are going to get a negative answer. So I have one negative here. 1 is an odd number. My answer is negative. Here I have two positive numbers, which is even, and here I have two negative numbers, which is an even number. And when I multiply those, I get a positive number. And that works especially when you're getting numbers like 3 times 5 times negative 2 times negative 3. So I can look at that and not necessarily get the answer right away in my head, but I can look at that and know whether my answer is going to be positive or negative. I have 1, 2, 3 negative numbers here that I'm multiplying. Because 3 is an odd number, I know my answer is going to be negative. And then I can ignore the signs. I can just multiply then. 3 times 5 is 15. 15 times 2 is 30. 30 times 3 is 90. I didn't even have to worry about the negative signs or anything. I just know that my answer is 90. I already put the negative sign right there when I looked and saw I had 1, 2, 3 negative signs. So if the number of negative signs is odd, your answer will always be negative. If the number of negative signs is even, your answer will always be positive. Okay, now and that's just in multiplication. What happens, a lot of students will go and see negative 3 plus negative 5 times negative 2 and count the negative signs and say, oh, there's an odd number of negative signs here, therefore my answer is going to be negative. But that is only when it's multiplication. We have a plus sign here which messes that all up. But I can look here, and this is just multiplication between these two numbers, a negative and a negative. I've got two of them. 2 is positive, or 2 is even, so therefore my answer will be positive. So I'm going to get a positive 10 here, and then I'm going to add negative 3. And that goes back to some previous lessons about how to add and subtract positive and negative numbers. So again, that should be fairly straightforward and easy. I'm not going to go into the theory about why multiplication works. Most of you don't really care why it works. You just want to know how it works. So that brings us to some examples. And the first example that I'm going to pull out for you to look at is example 6. And there's 4 different problems there that we're going to look at. Example 6. One looks like this. One is a negative 6, and we're going to square it. The next one is a negative 6, and we're going to square it, or appears to be a negative 6. And here we've got negative 4 cubed, and our letter D that looks like that. All right, so we're going to look at how to do each one of these. Now, a couple things to keep in mind when you're doing these is that your -6 is in parentheses. That means the negative is attached to the 6. This is one unit here. This is one piece, this -6. So that means we are going to do -6 times -6, because remember that's what this square means here. So we're going to take the number inside the parentheses and we're going to multiply it by itself. Okay, so -6 times -6. In this particular one, we have two negatives, an even number of negatives here, so our answer is going to be positive, and we get a positive 36. Okay, so let's look at this one here. This negative and the 6 are not in the parentheses. When they are not in the parentheses, this negative is not part of what is being squared. The only thing that's being squared in this one is the 6. And that means we're going to square the 6 and get 36. And this negative then is going to get put right there on your answer. Okay, that is one of the biggest mistakes that you'll make in math that will give you the wrong answer. And it's one of those things that you'll constantly fight with, is remembering those rules for those. Okay, so let's look at the next one. We have -4, and it's in parentheses, so I can call it a -4, and we're going to cube it. So we're going to take -4 times -4 times -4. Okay, so I have three negatives. So when you have three negatives, 3 is odd, so I know my answer is going to be negative. And now I just multiply 4 times 4 times 4. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. And that's my answer there, -64. Now let's look at this one. This says we're going to take 4 times 4 times 4, get an answer, and put a negative on it when we're all done. So 4 times 4 is 16, times 4 is 64, and then we're going to put this negative on the answer. Okay, so a key thing here when you're looking at these is when the negative is in parentheses with the 4, with the digit, then that becomes one number. That's a -4. And then you just take -4 times -4 times -4. When the negative is not in a parenthesis, the negative gets put on at the end. So this goes away for right now, and you just worry about the 4 in the cube. 4 times 4 times 4, and at the end you put the negative back on it, because this means the opposite of whatever 4 cubed is. 4 cubed is 64. The opposite is a -64. This does not mean take the opposite of 4 after you cube it. It means take -4 and cube the -4. The negative is a part of the number 4. Okay, very, very important. That's why I spend a little bit more time on that, so you can get a hold of what's going on here. All right, let's look at another example. Let's look at example 7 here. Get rid of some of the stuff here. And number 7 is -4 plus 5 times -6 plus 2. All right, and we have what is called an order of operations, the order that you put your numbers together. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in one of the other lessons. But for right now, let's look at this. We always do what is inside the parentheses first. Always, always, always. When you've got a list of numbers, if there's a set of parentheses, you just don't do anything else until what's inside the parentheses is done. So let's do that first. We're just going to look at that. We're going to leave everything else alone. We'll make our parentheses, and we'll do this part right here, -6 plus 2. Now you remember, when you're adding numbers, if the signs between the two numbers are different, in this case a negative and a positive, you take the difference between the two numbers and you put the sign of the largest number on your answer. So we get negative 4. Okay. Next thing that we're going to do after we do everything in the parentheses, in this case, is we're going to do the multiplication. We're going to ignore the plus sign right now. Don't do the plus sign. That's not the right order. You do what's in the parentheses, then you do the multiplication. So in this case, we're going to look just at this part, and we're going to take 5 times negative 4. We're going to leave everything else alone. We're going to take 5 times negative 4, and that is a negative 20. Okay? Now I've got an addition problem. The thing about this addition problem is my signs are different, or my signs are the same. So I've got a negative 4 and a negative 20. When the signs are the same, you add the two numbers together, and you put the sign on your answer, and you get negative 24. All right, let's look at example 8 real quick. Okay, this is example number 8. And again, we're going to do what's in the parentheses first. We're going to look at this set of parentheses and this set of parentheses. Not going to worry about anything else. So let's take the first set here, negative 3, and we'll just do them in one step. So we have a 2 minus 9. Well, if you remember right, we decided that it might be easier to start out by doing that. Instead of 2 minus 9, make it 2 plus negative 9. And let's do the same thing with the other parenthesis. Negative 7 plus a negative 2. Okay, now let's look at this first set here. The signs are different, so we take the difference between the two and put the sign of the largest number there. Okay, now I've got one number in the parenthesis. The next set here, we're going to do the same thing. The signs are the same, so we're going to add the two and put the sign of the numbers on our answer, and we have a negative 9. All right, now the next step, like I told you, after you do what's in the parentheses, is you do the multiplication. We do not do the addition first. We do the multiplication. So we're going to take these two signs. We have two minus signs, an even number of minus signs. So that tells me my answer there between the negative 3 and the negative 7 is going to be positive. And then I'm going to look at this here. And I have one negative sign. 1 is an odd number. So I'm still going to multiply and get 36, but because I have an odd number of negatives, my answer is going to be negative. Okay, so now I can do my addition here, and again my signs are different, so I'm going to take the difference between the two numbers and put the sign of the largest number on my answer, and I get negative 15. So that's negative 8. And that's it for the lecture on problems, or section 1.4.